How's it going?
Good evening, everyone. I am so thrilled for today's guest. Today's guest is Carol Roth, whom you guys may recall from when we had her on Timcast IRL. She's also a New York Times best-selling author. Her latest book is called The War on Small Business, but she has an upcoming book that I'm really excited to talk about. It's called You Will Own Nothing: Your War with a New Financial World Order and How to Fight Back. I would ask you, Carol, what you've been up to lately, but it sounds like you're working on a book. What can you tell us about this book? Sounds amazing.
Yes, so unfortunately, this was not the book that I wanted to write, but was the book that I had to write. You hear these things coming out of the World Economic Forum. You will own nothing and you'll be happy. The top prediction of 8 predictions for 2030. And of course, my gut reaction, being a fairly common sense person, is that this must be a conspiracy theory. Like, there's no way that this organization that is, populated with elite and business leaders and political leaders is calling for the end of private property. So, of course, I did my research, and right out there in the open, stemming from an article and then in this wonderful video that many of us have seen, it says, "You will own nothing." And so that really stuck with me. And as I started sort of part and parceling all these different things that were happening, with the government, Fed and government policy, monetary and fiscal policy, with big tech, with corporations coming in to compete with individuals to buy single family homes, with ESG, which I consider business social credit, with personal social credit, on and on and on. I really saw this through line. And I think that's, kind of what I do, is that I take these really big economic, financial, and business concepts and I create this through line, whether you're a novice or a pro, and put it all together. And it's very clear that as we are approaching a new financial world order, which we can talk more about, that you have the elite who are jockeying to control all of the resources and make sure that they're coming out on top. And that means that you will own nothing. And that's not acceptable to me. I am a advocate for the American dream. I want you to own as much as possible, but you have to understand what's going on in order to be able to fight back. So that's kind of the plan here.
That's a great summary, and I love it. I actually wrote a piece called, I forget what I titled it exactly. It was something about the boomer American dream and how we're going to have to probably scale back our expectations there. Not that I want to, but it looks to me like that's something we're going to have to do. Do you disagree with that sentiment? Do you think we're going to be able to retain it?
Well, I think it depends on the person. The reality is that a crazy statistic that I found when I was researching the book that kind of sets up this reality is that millennials actually make more at age 40 on an inflation adjusted basis. So not including the inflation, but inflation adjusted basis than Gen X did and that the boomers did at that time. So they're actually making more, but they have substantially less wealth. And there are a whole slew of reasons that I uncovered for this, including obviously what the Fed and government has done with purchasing power, but also inflating assets. A lot of their policy has inflated assets to the benefit of the wealthy, while creating inflation that obviously burdens the middle and working class. And you've seen this inflation in things like college, which, if you're somebody who goes to school, you're now paying, in some cases, high 5 to 6 figures for an education that's worth a fraction of that. And that's delaying home ownership. So there are some structural things that can change to recapture what that American dream means. Certainly the government and the Fed and all of their, useful idiots are making it very difficult. The other thing that's coming up, which I talk about, is that there is a major voluntary wealth transfer on the horizon. There is $84.4 trillion in assets that is set to turn over in the next 23 years. So people who are old passing down via inheritance to their kids.
Gotcha.
So if we don't let the government get their grubby little hands on that, it's very possible that these boomers who've sucked up all the wealth actually can pass some of that back down, assuming they don't use it up in the healthcare system, other situation. But
Gosh,
but
yeah.
my concern, based on the level of liabilities that the government has, the promises that they've made, unfunded liabilities and the like, is that money is very much at risk too. So I do think there are paths for us to move down. It's just the question of, does anybody have a backbone? And the other thing that's very frustrating to me, which I'm sure you will appreciate, is the amount of bleep that everybody is focused on that is just not important, while our financial foundation and future is being completely wrecked. So instead of people protesting the Fed or protesting the budget or actually being concerned about stuff that affects your day-to-day life, you're caught up in a bunch of junior high drama, and that's not helping the situation either.
Yes, I thoroughly appreciate that and completely agree, because it is really frustrating to see people just be utterly distracted. And it's not even by celebrities since the pandemic. It's by total and utter nonsense, typically spun by our celebrity politicians, who can say these really big statements and kind of push these grandiose ideas that we know have no bearing at all on our actual lives. And we know they're just pushing them so they can stay in power and win re-election and all this other stuff. It feels like nobody's really standing up for the little guy. How do we kind of try to remedy that? Is there a practical way to do that?
Well, I think the most practical way is for people to do that first individually. People are very caught up in their own worlds, but don't really spend a lot of time thinking about not only their finances, but what it is that creates wealth. And creating wealth is asset ownership, particularly assets that have the opportunity to appreciate and value over time. So people are very focused on spending and a certain lifestyle, but aren't doing the things that really create that long-term wealth that give them that power. So I think the best way to protect the little guy is, as a little guy, to do that yourself and to rejigger things. And, I could sit down with any individual person and come up with a plan for you within a couple of years to completely change your financial situation and for you to start owning things. But you have to actually do the work in order to do that. And then it's also just being intentional in our actions, talking about things from my legacy book. When you have dollars to spend, where are you spending them? Are you seeking out to help the small businesses? Are you looking to do things that support the little guy? Or are you very much aligned with having, the scale and the convenience, which is okay. It's a choice. But if you keep doing that, it's kind of like this whole bank situation, this banking crisis. If you want to have that, well, even though I'm under the FDIC limit, I'm still going to go with one of the big guys because I feel safe. Well, then there's going to be no little guys left. So it's all a balance, and it's all personal choice, but the choices we make do lead to certain outcomes.
That is fantastic, because that really is something that each individual can do going forward. Now, I will give you a little bit of personal background on this one. Andy and I, my husband, are working on this right now. We're working on a form of the Dave Ramsey project. I'm
Nice.
sure you're probably familiar with him.
Yeah.
It's very hard. I know his motto is, you live like no one else, so you can ultimately live like no one else, which I really love. And my personal little, very, very small goal is to attempt this year, especially, to use things up instead of buying new things. So I'm going through, and I see this especially with cosmetic stuff, and you might notice this too, but of all these little bottles that I never got around to using, stuff that kind of doesn't work great for me, but I could make do with it. So I'm choosing to use that stuff instead of buying new stuff. And so far, I've been really pleased. I've been using up a lot of it. I'm like, okay, so this is great. This is not great. Now I know. Now I've used it for a little while. And I feel a little bit like my grandmother saving up tinfoil during the Great Depression, which might be a little bit hyperbolic when you think about it. But are you concerned about some kind of economic collapse going forward? I feel like the signs are there. How are you feeling about that right now?
All right, I'm going to start with my story, and then I'm going to move into economic collapse, just so that we can give people a second to take up to pause. But very much when I started my career, it was the same thing, that people who were earning money were going out and buying these big apartments. I stayed in a 400 square foot apartment. My bedside table was a cardboard box with a sheet over it for 5 years. I'm not joking. 5 years. I know that the box was actually from a stereo. I know which box it was. And that was
Amazing.
The way I could save every penny to pay down my debt, get out of debt and to start save. And then, your next step with the money that you're saving from your cosmetics addiction that we all have
Right.
is to actually take that money and put it to work for you, because that's something where you can earn an exponential return that just working alone doesn't do. Now, in terms of a pending financial collapse, what I am concerned about, and I think that I make a very strong case, is a new financial world order. And again, another thing that sounds very tinfoil hatty, but the reality is that it happens on a regular basis. History runs in cycles. At one point, past the Roman Empire, you had the Dutch, which issued the first global reserve currency that was country backed, the guilder. That lasted for a bit. Then there was war. The British came in. They were stronger. They had their imperial century. Then there was war. The U.S., sort of ascended. There was Bretton Woods, and now we are in the U.S. cycle, and we're about 80 years into our cycle. And since, we're all younger than 80 years old, we can't really imagine a time when we haven't been the center of the universe. But I would imagine that the British and the Dutch before us also couldn't imagine a time when they weren't the center of the universe.
Yep.
So you have to understand that this is a reality. And just because we haven't seen it personally doesn't mean that it hasn't existed in history. So there is, again, this is not a conspiratorial thing. This is a very well documented historical thing, that there are changes. And we're seeing, a lot of the signposts here. Obviously, we're seeing what has been happening to our purchasing power, to the amount of government debt, banking crises, kind of the issues in our fiat system. We've been seeing on an international stage, the U.S. weaponized the dollar when Russia invaded Ukraine. They froze reserve assets. That's historically unprecedented vis-a-vis a major power. And if you're, a country that's, maybe not really a big fan of the U.S. around the world, why do you want to pay for them to have the privilege of the world reserve currency and allow them to borrow cheaply, which the primary benefactor of that has been the U.S. government, when then they can turn around and weaponize that against you? So we're seeing what I'm calling the BRICS plus, Brazil, Russia, India, and China now trying to add in the Saudis and Iran, big oil producers. Oil has been based on lots of discussions over time, back in the 70s, what the dollar has been priced in terms, oil's been priced in terms of dollars, but that is something that can be shifted. And so now they're talking about settling energy in different currencies from around the world. Many of these countries have been loading up on their gold reserves so that perhaps they have, an underlying ability to settle in a different currency. So the idea that we are now going to be the sole reserve currency, we're going to have this sole pole position, is, I think, kind of faulty. And we're seeing the signposts. What we don't know is duration. We don't know how long this is going to take, because as I sort of talked about before, every major new financial world order has been precipitated by war as a catalyst. So, we don't really know how long this is going to take. And we also don't know what form it's going to take. It doesn't mean the U.S. is going to go away. We have a lot of productivity here, but it does mean that it may be more fractured. And then it's a question of, how badly that hurts us. Does it hurt us in terms of, some inflationary forces, or is it really, everyone moves away from the dollar and there's hyperinflationary forces because, you've got the climate cult saying we can't produce energy. So there are a lot of things that weigh in on it, but I am very concerned that the, next several decades are not going to look like the ones that we have lived through in the past. And this is going to be a big shock for people.
Oh boy. Okay. So we can foresee a shock coming down the pike, which could be bad, but it could also be positive in ways that we don't expect. Do you think that's fair to say? Is there any silver lining you can see based on what you can gather that you could possibly use to kind of encourage people? Because this is scary. I know it's a lot, but
it is.
History.
I mean, I think that the benefit that we have is, when we think about the money in the United States, there's nothing that backs it other than the quote, full faith in the government. But I would say
Right.
that's not actually what the faith is in. The faith is in the productivity of the American people and the military, of course, that secures it. But we are a productive people that have lots of ingenuity and lots of business, and that's not just going to go away, but it may be very bumpy as there is the transition. So I think that focusing not so much on your dollars, but on things that are productive and things that are hard assets that you can hold or you can feel and that have physical value is an important way to hedge against what's ahead. And so I think there are ways for people to kind of feel better, because it's going to be uncertain. It's going to be uncertain for a long time. And for a lot of us, we'd rather just know, right? Like just tell me if this is going to happen. As I said, it could take 15 years. It could take 30 years. We have no idea. It could take 6 months. So you have to not panic, but you have to be prepared. And I think that's the most important way. If you go walking through life worried, then you're worried for all of those days for nothing. Like if there's an issue, you're just going to deal with it, but that doesn't mean that you can't prepare for it. And I think that the preparation eases some of that burden and lets you walk through life a little bit lighter and a little bit happier and just enjoy day to day. Because here's the reality: we could all get hit by a bus tomorrow anyway, and then none of this matters, as my dad used to say. 100 years from now, none of this means anything. So enjoy your day-to-day life, have gratitude and appreciation, but do take time to prepare, and hopefully that gives you some sense of comfort.
I love that. I think that's really going to help people moving forward. That's really the only thing you can do. Now, I'm constantly belaboring some of the Stoic viewpoints that your perspective is the only thing you can truly control. I think that's true, but you can also control like your financial preparation. You can make sure that you're investing in the right things. So your actions and your perspective are the only thing you're responsible for. You're not responsible for people blowing out the federal budget. There's not a whole lot you can do about that except try to vote for people who are honest about what they promise. Now, you mentioned some of the anxiety around the climate crisis, and I have to read this headline, and I know you saw this article too from the New York Times. It's called, and I'm not making this up, "When Climate Change Melts Your Relationships," and the subtitle is "Everything Was Going Great Until I Told Him to Dump His Kerosene Lamp for an LED." What's your take on that right offhand?
Okay, so this is from a column they do called Modern Love, which what
Oh
a
boy.
sad statement on modern love. I hate to tell the author this, but I don't think that it's climate change that melted your relationship. I think it's
so
you.
either.
I think you are climate change. You just don't know it. It's really actually quite sad. And I will give the person credit, because most of the people who talk about climate emergencies don't actually do anything, right? They fly their private planes and are on their yachts and buy waterfront property. So at least she was attempting to make a change from kerosene lamps to LEDs. But it's really very sad that you have people who are walking around that have been so, no pun intended, gaslit, have so much anxiety that they really have this weird disconnect in their lives. I mean, obviously, again, they're not doing all the things that one would do if you really thought the earth was going to end, but enough that I must change this micro behavior because, my lover not using a kerosene lamp is really going to impact the fact that, China and India and Russia are polluting the whole world that, we all share the same sky with. Logic be damned. But it's just a sad state of affairs what this indoctrination has done to so many young people, and how they're walking through their life with these burdens that are just absolutely insane and ridiculous. And you can have thoughts and things that you like to do to try to be a better steward for the planet. We all think that's great, but I'm not sure that's the place to blow up a relationship over, right?
Right. I was so amused because I know how big a kerosene lamp is. It's 2 liters maybe of oil there in the bottom of the lamp. I know kerosene's not technically an oil, but her concern for this kerosene lamp is so outsized and hyperbolic. There's a quote I want to read 2 quotes from the article because you're right.
Oh, you actually read the article. I couldn't get past the headline.
I started reading it and then I just saw somebody had put together a few of the highlights. These 2 quotes. Okay. I didn't understand how he managed to go about his life without succumbing to the same existential dread and anger that plagued me. Wow, she is telling on herself, and I do feel truly terrible for her. Like, what kind of life is that? That's allowing yourself to be played by the people who are controlling the media. They're controlling the narrative, and ultimately what's happening with you, dear journalist, is that they are controlling your life, which whew, holy cow. And then the last one is, I was on the verge of tears. The situation felt entirely irreconcilable. So yes, your assessment of what actually sank this poor relationship was not the kerosene lamp. It sounds like it was 100% this poor woman who is ideologically possessed. And that's relatively funny, but it reminded me of this anxiety that people my age, millennials, have about having kids as it relates to the climate crisis. And that gets a little bit more serious. Yeah. Something like 1/3 of millennials are saying, you know what, I feel like I can't justify having children in a world where we're going to all be, drowned on the coasts if we don't do something about this. And no one's doing anything about it. And I cannot, for one, imagine having that level of anxiety, but is there any way we bounce back from that and start to see reality again before it's too late? And I don't say that to be hyperbolic. If we don't have enough children, there's no more people. And then what? We won't be there to worry about it. So it will be a non-issue. But how do you think we can stop this in its tracks?
It's a really good question. I mean, as you're saying these things and as I think about it, and I don't mean this personally in a hyperbolic way, but it sounds very much like a cult, right? That they've bought into, I know people call it a climate cult, but I mean like an actual cult. When I think about people who drank the Kool-Aid or who all wore the Nikes or who put their hands on a, thing and are trying to get to Xenu or whatever. I mean, that is cultish behavior. And that is what's happening here, both at the level of personal anxiety about walking through life with, this kind of, situation where people are being controlled and feeling this presence that is weighing on them, to actually making significant life altering choices based on these third party dictates. And I'm somebody, I've chosen not to have kids for personal reasons, and so I can understand that there are a variety of reasons why people decide to can't either decide or just literally cannot have children. But, to have it be dictated by this, kind of fantasy that's being put out by a cult of people who are looking to control, who they themselves are not participating in the same, kinds of endeavors, and are just saying, well, that's okay for me, but for you, you really need to do this. It's really bad. And I mean, it's sort of Darwinism, I guess, in a sense, because those people who have the crazy beliefs will die out, and the people who say, yeah, no, I'm going to go ahead and have kids and repopulate the world and put my values on it, are going to be the ones that remain. So maybe that is a level of, just sort of natural selection. But it is very sad. And obviously I'm really great at economics. Cult busting is not real high on my list, not even on TV. So I'm sure there are things that can be done, but it's almost like you have to like individually take these people and like deprogram them and just kind of like put them in a room, a quiet room with evidence, and lock them in there until they figure out like this guy who's telling you that the planet's going to blow up, and oh, by the way, has been doing so for the last 50 years and it hasn't, is like had just bought a waterfront mansion for $20 million and is, flying on his private plane. He don't care. So actions speak louder than words. You can still be a great steward, but you don't have to walk through life with this burden. And
Yes.
again, that not my wheelhouse, but I, as a problem solver, that's sort of how I would perhaps approach it.
I think you're entirely right. I think the best way to reach these people is with a great deal of compassion. And
Yes.
also, I would argue that the case can be made that people who don't want to have kids certainly should not. I hate the idea of people being forced to have children who don't want them. Those kids are not going to have a good life. The
Right.
parents' lives are just going to be miserable. No reason to push people who don't want kids to have them. I think that people who do want to have them should not be discouraged from having them,
Correct.
though. And I could make the case, if we are going to have an overbearing government, that we should probably incentivize having families. I don't think there's any way to look at a declining birth rate and say, yes, this is going to be very good for our economy in the long
No.
run. I think that's crazy talk. If you don't have enough workers, you lose to the next biggest guy. If your economy isn't able to compete, where's the silver lining in that? I don't think there is one. You just end up.
Go ahead.
Sorry. I was just going to say, you just end up being the secondary power, and there's not really a good way to bounce back.
Yeah, and this is an issue that is plaguing, not just the US, but all developed nations, and also China, based on, their idiotic one child policy that they had for so long. And for them, it's even worse because it was limited to one child. They had so many boys, horrendous situation. But when you have a bunch of men who don't have potential mates who are young, we know what that ends up turning into. That energy has to be directed somewhere, and that often is directed in, revolutionary types of forces. So this is an issue that's plaguing, a lot of the developed nations in the world. And from a social safety net standpoint, from just a regular economic production standpoint, and from a potential revolutionary standpoint, it's not a good situation. And then the worst part about it is then you've got all of these boomers who have all the money, who then want the young people to give up more to support them. And, given the disparity in wealth that has been created, not by merit, but by government policy and by monetary policy, to ask the young people to give up anything more is really despicable.
I do agree with that as well. And I don't judge boomers as a whole, or I try not to. But it's hard to look at them and be like, oh, yeah, they didn't really do anything wrong. They voted for these policies. They kept them in power. They were in the right place at the right time, which is certainly not their fault. But now they are asking young people to continue to prop up this failing infrastructure because it will make their lives easier for the next 20 years. Paying absolutely no mind to what it's going to do, not just to millennials, but then to Gen Z and the potential children that these generations might have. And this utterly solipsistic focus on me being comfortable and feeling safe is just really mind-boggling. And I keep harping this, but I think we are in that part of the cycle of hard times, strong men, good times, weak men. We are seeing the weakest of the weak men because those were amazing times. Like, there really was a rise in American society that boomers were so lucky to get to experience. And I honestly think that's part of the reason I think we should probably retool our view of the American dream, because what they had, very, very, very unusual, very rare, unheard of for royalty in past years to be able to own, this piece of property and to have these boundaries on their property and to be able to do and spend however they wanted. On the topic of the American dream, do you think there's hope for, and then, we'll ask if there's hope, and then we'll segue into being slightly more positive overall. Do you think there's hope for millennials as far as owning homes goes? How do you feel about that?
So, just like everything else, there's absolutely hope and there's a path forward. We just need everyone to be pushing for that path forward. So, there's two issues. Well, there's a whole host of issues, but two kind of issues, that are plaguing millennials when it's coming to buy a house. One is their personal financial situation. So, from a personal austerity standpoint, being willing to make those changes, and probably somewhat bigger than using up your cosmetics. But, really, we're talking the cardboard box on the side of the bed kind of austerity changes to get yourself out of debt and back into a position where you can purchase something, and maybe tampering your expectations, because you have to remember too, the average square foot of a house back, when we had the American dream versus what people are looking for now is also apples and oranges. But there is that personal side. And then there's the governmental side of it, the amount of rules and regulations that restrict supply of homes and add cost to it. National Association of Home Builders did a study, I think it was 2021, and the regulations at the state, local, federal levels on up add almost $100,000. It was like $94,000 to the average price of a new home that's built. Now, I'm not saying every regulation needs to go away. Obviously, we need to have homes that are safe, and electricians that aren't going to set up wiring that you'll burn down the house. But it's certainly not $94,000. And oh, by the way, that was up from like 60 something, a decade before.
Wow.
So if we can cull back the regulations, we can increase supply that puts downward pressure on the price of homes. If we are able to get some of that regulation, all these things that increase housing affordability. And then there's the whole issue of the Fed's easy money, which gave corporate buyers not only the access to, but the desire to come and compete with individuals to buy up homes and rent them the American dream instead of letting you own that. I think there needs to be some more pushback against that. Just from a moral standpoint, it's not like something that they earned on their own. This is something that didn't exist before the Great Recession financial crisis. So this has been driven particularly by policy that's driven, as I said, non-merit-based wealth inequality. And I have no problem with wealth inequality if it's merit-based, but when it's driven by cronyism and it's driven by monetary and government policy, I have a huge problem with it. And so I think we need more people pushing back against that. So there are things that can be done, but we all need to have the cojones to be able to go out and do these things. And that's, why I think it's so important to empower people with this information and let them do it on their own, share the information with other people, get together with like-minded people in their community, and act, as I always say, individually together. I'm an individualist, I'm not a collectivist. So it's individually together. You can all row in the same direction without, having this sort of collectivist view that it's for us. Because I think there are a lot of people whose goals are aligned. And so there's just opportunities, but you're going to have to be willing to change the way that you think about them in order to pursue it. And it's very important. I have a good friend who many of you know, and I'm not going to call her out by name, but we've just been talking, and we finally got her, in a space where she felt comfortable with purchasing a new home. And it turns out that her mortgage payment is going to be the same as her rent payment was. Now she has a place that is, much bigger in size, and, something that she's actually building up equity towards. And so I think a lot of people, she had to make some changes, she had to make some sacrifices to do it. But I think a lot of people need to rethink, what's going to make sense for me in order for me to have the ability to have ownership. And I think, Lydia, one of the things that you said that was so insightful that I really just want to put an underscore under is how unusual this is. It used to be that wealth passed vertically, right? That basically you had a king or a nobleman, and his mostly son ended up inheriting it. And this wonderful system that was, sort of started in England, but really, brought to a new level here in the United States with the protection of individual rights and property rights, allowed for horizontal transmission. So you and I to be able to exchange, and for us to move wealth in a horizontal fashion amongst a wide, diverse group of people instead of that vertical fashion. And that's something that you noted, and I think is really important and needs to be preserved, because again, the wealthy and wealth connected are trying to keep it amongst that small group of people and make it more of a vertical kind of thing than a horizontal, everybody participates thing. And it doesn't work. If everybody doesn't have a chance to go after the American dream, there is no American dream.
I think that's very insightful too, because The reason I have worked with a lot of people who came to the US from places like Kenya, Nigeria, from places like Mexico, where there was much less opportunity. And
Yeah.
one of the things that they were super focused on was making the American dream happen for them. And at the time I was working with them, this made me feel very patriotic and inspired, because I was like, you're right. There is the option to make it happen for you. And the numbers do bear this out. People who come
Yeah.
from other countries tend to be incredibly motivated to work their tails off and to make this happen for them. And what it typically results for, or at least did in the past before this increased inflation and increased taxation, was that people like Nigerian migrants were wealthy people. People
Yeah.
from even places like Vietnam and the Philippines were also similarly wealthy, because they came with a singular purpose, and that was to make good on the opportunity that was given to them. Now, nothing was truly promised to them except that they were going to be given the chance to make this happen. And I always kind of viewed them as kind of role model Americans, because they came into it with the understanding that, yes, it was going to be hard. Yes, they were going to have to work. No, they weren't going to be able to compete with the Joneses, at least not for a really long time. They were going to have to live like no one else, like Dave says, so that they were able to, ultimately accomplish what they thought was promised to an American citizen. And now, unfortunately, I feel like a lot of that has disappeared. I feel like the working class has lost a lot of their buying power. You see it every time you go to the store. There was a woman who made a TikTok video about how she and her partner cumulatively earned about $100,000 a year. And she was saying, I go to the store and I'm not able to buy hardly anything. And you know what really frustrated me? I'm going to vent a little bit about this. Instead of saying, hey, who's to blame for this? This is, our politicians at the top. They're really rich people who want you to keep paying more. The fact that we printed $1 trillion or bazillion dollars just out of thin air, and we gave a bunch of that to another country, that's really probably what's to blame here. A lot of conservative thinkers said, this is your fault for not being good enough with money. So what do you think is the right balance between holding people accountable for being responsible for pursuing that American dream and saying, yes, some of this is entirely the fault of the government?
Well, I think if you go back to your Nigerian example, and all these people who become fantastic entrepreneurs, and the numbers bear that out, they're very successful, particularly entrepreneurship and creating their own path. But they're in a different, that hard times create strong men. They're in the hard times part, right? They're coming from a hard land, which has made them strong, and they're bringing that strength over here, while the people are here are in the good times create weak men part of the thing. And so they're viewing it from a very different perspective. So I would say in your example that there is some of both. The idea in this country that you should earn six figures and not be able to, go out and eat. And the reality is, I've seen, you've seen that go to a restaurant and costs are double or triple, what they've been. And it's hard for them to make ends meet. But I always go like, who's affording this? Like how are these people here? I don't even understand. I think there's both. I think that you have to be realistic about the situation that you're in and be willing to make sacrifices, and adjust your expectations, but you need to call out the reality of what's happened. And I've seen everybody blamed except for the perpetrators. The people on the far left like to blame capitalism. Somehow the capitalism is the one that created all of this. I'm not sure how free choice has anything to do with, as you said, money printing, suppression of interest rates, disrupting the labor market, decreasing the supply of energy, and so on and so forth. None of that sounds like capitalism to me. That all sounds like monetary and government policy and cronyism. And then, as you said, then you get these other people who I don't even know if they have the wherewithal to understand that litany of things I just told you. And, this used to be part of the zeitgeist. There's this really great clip that went around probably about a year ago with Dan Aykroyd on Saturday Night Live, and he was playing President Jimmy Carter, and he was just mocking the whole thing and being like, hey, so even you can be a millionaire. Did you ever want to wear a coat that costs $10,000 and drive a $100,000 car. Well, now you can. And he was like really making funny and then talking about money printing. And it seemed like the people then who had fewer distractions and, more cohesive set of information really understood what was driving those issues and were able to, create some satire and push back. Back at the time this was happening in the 70s, people were protesting the Fed. I've read stories in the New York Times from that time period where I guess car dealers were mailing keys in, and lumber dealers were sending lumber. Like, people really understood the source of the issue, and that wasn't anywhere near the issue that we have today. And the inability to focus and to say, these are the things that affect my life on a day-to-day basis, and if I don't have a strong country with a strong financial foundation, like, none of this other stuff that we're worried about means anything, because we're all going to end up being owned by Lord knows who, and who knows what rights we're going to have. We need to push back. And I also think that just understanding how property rights and individual rights and economic rights tie into your freedoms. I don't think people realize how important it is. If you own nothing, they own you. Period.
Yes.
End of story. So this is really important for the concept of freedom. And I think that's why, we've had something called the American dream, which is so precious, and why we really need to stand up and take that back.
I love it, and I think you're entirely correct. I feel like I've been saying that a lot, but you have a lot of wonderful points. My husband noted that you are anti-collectivist, and he wanted to ask if Ayn Rand influenced you at all in your philosophical leanings.
It's very possible that she did.
Yeah.
I certainly, don't agree with every single thing Ayn Rand said, or really anybody else says, but I do think that the concept of being an individual and the way that she was able to portray the importance of that, and that the individual is the smallest minority, and using that sort of language to distinguish between what's my right and what is sort of this idea of collectivism. Certainly she is one of those thinkers. I think there are other people too, the Milton Friedmans of the world, who, by the way, used to make the rounds on the talk shows, right? You can go back and watch old clips of Donahue, and he's interviewing Ayn Rand and Milton Friedman and all these wonderful people. So again, this was part of the discourse. I'm not being invited on, whoever the equivalent of Donahue is these days, to have a discussion about, money printing, or, financial world orders, or petrodollars, or anything like that. And, in some ways you have to think that potentially it's intentional.
I completely agree. In fact, that was going to be my next question. So when you were talking about how people are a lot more distracted now, I was like, that feels like it might be a little bit of a conspiracy, not even a conspiracy theory, but an actual full-on conspiracy to keep people from paying attention to things that actually really affect them. Like the TikTok thing, that's being overblown and a super distraction at this point. And the solution they're introduced, I don't know if you've read this bill or read anything about it. Holy cow, it's just Patriot Act 2.0. They're literally just setting it up so they can, put you in jail for using a VPN. I need to get into the nitty gritty, but this is something I saw go by, and I was like, that's insane, but it doesn't surprise me, because we have a bunch of new tech, and now they're like, how can we keep the kind of control that we were able to get a grasp on after 9/11? And that's incredibly worrying too. Do you think that stuff, since we mentioned TikTok, do you think that apps like TikTok, Instagram, other places, Twitter even, much as I love Twitter, it is a distraction, and it is very shortening of our attention span. Do you think that that is contributing to people's inability to grasp the overarching plot behind what's happening to us?
Well, I would just go back to the Roman Empire and bread and circuses. And there was a reason why they built these, giant colosseums and had gladiator fights and kept everybody entertained with, all the various things that they kept them entertained with. That was deliberate. And so to say that there's not a study of that has said, how do we keep people distracted? I certainly think that humans want to connect, so it was going to happen anyway. But the idea that they're not being co-opted in a way to push more information that's ridiculous and keep you distracted by things that aren't important is one of it. But I also think some of it's just human nature. I mean, people don't want to think about bad things. Some of the
True.
stuff that's, kind of silly is more like team sports. It's like, hey, here's my nemesis and here's my way to jockey back and forth and make me angry and have like, this thing going on without really having to think about the really bad stuff. But if we don't proactively think about the really bad stuff, then you have to reactively think about it. And it's much, much worse to reactively think about it than to stop it. Unfortunately, technology changes. We have all these advancements, but human nature remains very much constant. And I think that's sort of the battle. I think that's why history rhymes. I think that's why we have these cycles. And, there's a piece of it that, I'm a fighter. I'm going to fight until the very end, and then I'm going to pick back up and fight again. But there is sort of this kind of feudalistic aspect of it, where, well, it's just sort of a matter of time. So can I prolong that pain maybe for another couple generations, and then maybe give them a shot at it? I don't know. Or let the robots kill us all. I don't know.
That's one solution that could work.
Right. Yeah.
Well, you mentioned that human nature does not change, and I'm glad you mentioned that, because I just pulled up this quote from Marcus Tullius Cicero, who's one of my favorite thinkers, someone I call one of the original libertarians because he was a statesman. He said the evil was not inbred in circuses per se, but in the willingness of the people to sell their rights as free men for full bellies and the excitement of the games, which would serve to distract them from the other human hungers which bread and circuses can never appease. And I have to say, I think that's as accurate now as it was then.
Yeah.
I think that's exactly what we're seeing. I think that's basically, instead of bread and circuses, literally, we used to have sports. Now, since COVID, basically we have much more of the just social media, direct, straight into your veins, dopamine rushes that are really, we're finding not good for young people. But do you think, you mentioned that you're not going to be taken on to shows that would be like the equivalent of Donahue back in the 70s or 80s. Do you think that partisanship is also intentional to keep people not just distracted, but divided? It's like our new sports. We're just pointed against each other.
100%. Like you said, politics is not only a sport, but it's also a religion. So it's become very dangerous as it's replaced both of those things. And the people who are at the top, if you ever hear stories about them out and about together, they're laughing, they're, slapping each other on the back. Like, it's a game. If you look at what they do, I always say, Congress is a place where they perform political theater and legally launder money. I mean, that's basically what it is. There's a theatrical aspect to it. I don't believe that most of the people who are there to solve problems. I believe they are performers and they're performing this game. And they love the fact the more divided we are and the more that we have this sport of, kind of jockeying between two major parties with, us in the center kind of caught in, whatever crossfire, or, hey, you're sitting on my team this week or whatnot, the less people are focused on those important things and the less, kind of anger that is directed at the people who are perpetrating this. I mean, just the idea, I see this from both sides, politicians coming on social media and like whining, like, we need to stop X. And it's like, you're in Congress, you do it. That's your entire job. What do you mean? Like, you're getting paid multiple six figures a year and getting all, these great perks. That's your thing to do. Like, do it. You've had, multiple times you've been elected. Like, why are you talking about this on Twitter? Stop it.
Yep, exactly. And I forget who it is that puts it this way, but it's like, I just know Joe Biden is going to get out there and fire off a tweet like, who's the president? I want to have a word with him. Like, yeah, right. It's you, buddy. It is. And I don't even want to get started on Joe Biden because he's a whole different kettle of fish. But I think I agree with the partisan stuff. And that's kind of why I brought it up. But that's not the only way they're sowing this division. They're using racial, they're using gender divides. They've introduced this incredibly distracting gender ideology that's really got everybody riled up, and I think is causing some of the deepest rifts in our society. But since we're starting to wrap up here, I have to say, I think that part of the problem, like we saw with the lady talking about how climate change crisis melted her relationship, and how Alexandria, I know, crazy, and how AOC is planning to not have kids because of this. What it looks like to me is that these people are looking at a huge global problem instead of doing what Jordan Peterson calls cleaning their own room. And he uses that line, and people think it's a throwaway, but it's not. He talks about how people who are lobbying for huge systemic changes like bringing back communism are not even capable of keeping their own rooms clean. He's like, you really think you can pull off utopia when you can't even make a dentist appointment, when you can't even manage your own bank account, when you live in your parents' basement? Like, bring your own life into order, and then you can start to kind of look around the world. And even then, once you get your own life in order, you start to realize how incredibly complicated everything is. Like, never mind being married or being in a long-term relationship with another person. That's when you start to realize how it's not just you, and even a relationship with just one other person is not just about the two of you. Human life is so incredibly exponential and fractal that we can never account for every single thing. That's why I think the Stoics and people like Cicero were onto something truly profound when they said the only thing you should focus on is this moment and the things that you can change. And you've been so great over the course of the conversation because you've been giving advice for how to take responsibility for all this stuff. And I think that probably a good sentiment to leave people with as we're wrapping up here is to point out that you can't control the Fed. You can't control the politicians who lie about what they're going to do once they're in office, but you can get your own bank account in order. You can reduce your own debt by doing crazy things like having a box with a sheet over it for your bedside table, which I think is genius. You can take steps to make the world better in your own way, under your own power. It's not outside of your reach. So I know that you want people to be able to invest in certain things. What do you think is probably the best investment for someone who has successfully saved the money and gotten out of debt and made sure that their own lives are starting to get to be in order? What's a good place to start with that's not leveled against us at every turn at this point?
Yes. So obviously anything that you invest in yourself is obviously a great thing, but outside of being cliche. So first of all, I have to disclaim this because, the government's okay if you go out and blow a bunch of money on a gold toilet, but God forbid you're investing in something, it requires 900 disclaimers. So this is not financial advice. These are just informational things for you to check out, and you should talk to your financial advisor based on your own personal risks and objectives. Okay. So now I've done cover my behind language. I think it's really important to be diversified because one of the things that we don't know is what is going to be ahead of us. And so obviously the percentage of your diversification depends on your age and your risk objectives and your goals. And do you have, near-term things you're trying to spend, your money on? But a couple of things to note, if you do have a company that does a 401k match, that means that every dollar you're putting in, they are putting in on a tax deferred basis. Like that's like getting 50%, free and then tax deferred. Like you should do that. That's really a really good deal. Like max that out as much as you can. But you shouldn't just rely on stocks because there's a lot of volatility that's going on. Although I do argue that the people who are on Wall Street are going to look to save themselves first. So, if you can't lick them, join them. So that's an important thing. On the debt front, right now you can get between 4 and 5% on short duration treasuries and products that sort of mimic that, perhaps a preferred money market account. So something that's at a 4 month, 6 month or year duration, doesn't tie up your money long term, gives you some good yield. Yes, it's not exactly keeping up with inflation, but you're still like getting pretty close. And, it's quote unquote pretty safe in a short duration. If that goes by the wayside, grab your guns and ammo, and we're gonna have Armageddon, and none of this is gonna matter anyway. So you have to have at least faith in that, and then do diversify into things that are in a form factor that you control. This is a silver round, one that I actually designed.
Yes.
With the Betsy Ross flag on it. Yes,
that's awesome.
With gold line, but like have this. Like this is tangible. If something goes wrong, like Venezuela, I can take this and I can go in to the doctor and say I have silver, I have gold, like, can you do something for me? And nobody's taking that away from me without coming through, guns and a big fight first. So having some, experts usually say 5 to 10% of your portfolio in something alternative is important. Trying to own land that has a productive use, whether you have a house, whether you have tenants, whether it has timber on it, whether it has a farm on it, any of those kinds of things that are hard, that aren't going away. And then I know that being a part of the millennials, people are going to say, what about Bitcoin? I don't know. I don't know. My best advice from my father, who was incredibly financially savvy. My father never went to college. He was an electrician, but he started my credit score when I was 10 by getting me a credit card, and gave me all of my financial prowess comes from my dearly departed dad. But he said, if you don't understand something, don't invest in it. So if you can explain what a restaurant chain is, and you can explain what a gold chain is, but you cannot explain what a blockchain is, you need to do that research and not just rely on somebody else. And if you have an important thesis, maybe it is part of your diversification, but diversify, make that, a piece of it. I have concerns that, for these kind of, hedges, if everything goes down, everything goes down. And if you have these governments who are looking to hold on to power, they're doing everything they can to make it harder. So I think there are hurdles to overcome. I don't necessarily mean that or think that means that they can't be overcome. I just don't know. There's not enough of a social proof. This has got 5,000 years of social proof. So the future may not be like the past, but I'm feeling pretty okay when central banks around the world put, over 1,100 tons of gold into their reserves last year. That's still a pretty stable thing that's accepted around the world. But the key point of this is diversify, because, when one thing goes awry, something else can help you out, and make sure you have some hard assets and things that are in a form factor you can control. And if you, are feeling, like Lydia was at one point in time, I am, I'm in debt. I don't have any money. I don't know what to do. You can do it, whether you have to work some extra hours, whether you have to cut back on your spending, whether you have to change your living situation. These are the things that you do in the short term so that you don't have to worry about money in the long term. It's much better to have that short-term pain and discomfort and work towards a goal, which, by the way, is really gratifying when you get there, and you'll actually appreciate that, than to have money be a concern for you over the duration of your life. And if there's nothing else that you take away from this, what I thought was a very robust discussion, because Lydia's fantastic, I think that's it. Make those short-term sacrifices so you can have the long-term peace of mind.
100%. Okay, I want to plug finally your book, and then we'll wrap so you can get on to your next meeting. Do you want to say your title, or should I read the whole thing?
You can do it, and then I'll do it after you. How about that? We'll just double down on it.
Sounds great. You Will Own Nothing, Your War with a New Financial World Order and How to Fight Back, available on Amazon, it looks like, starting in July. Correct?
Well, it's actually available now, but if you go to carolroth.com/nothing, I'm going to have some pre-order bonuses. So I'll email you about that or you can just go to your favorite retailer. But again, they want you to own nothing. You will own nothing. That is not acceptable. That is Marxist. That is communist. I want you to own everything. And it's why you need to buy the book, so that you can set yourself up and those around you to have ownership, because ownership means they don't own you.
Amazing. Yes. Thank you so much, Carol, for joining us. I'm going to let you get on to your next thing. Great chat. We'll see you again next time. Thank you so much. Until next time. Bye, guys.
Thanks for having me.
Bye. how's it going?